Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you to the National Cemetery Administration for making this Untold Stories program possible. My name is Lynn O'Hara. I'm the Deputy Director of Ed Programs here at National History Day. We appreciate you all being with us. Unfortunately, Ken Holiday is not allowed to be with us tonight, but we'll send him the video afterwards. I know how to get a hold of him. What we're going to be doing tonight is focusing on the concept of historical context and looking at some messages through what's going on in World War II. And then we're going to be looking at the World War II communities and some specific research strategies. But let's go ahead and start with everybody's favorite housekeeping. Nobody likes to do it, but it has to be done. Google Classroom has sent you an email right now that says your webinar is late. It's cool. Don't worry. We'll get you graded tomorrow. Throughout, you have access to the Q&A box. You also have live captioning. We do have chat disabled because we have students here, and yeah, no, I'm not doing that. Remember to do your survey at the end for your attendance credit. And there are lots of great images in tonight's webinar. We're going to get you slides and PDFs so you can cherry pick and snip all kinds of cool ones for your lessons. Don't worry about that. It'll be up tomorrow morning. We're now working on our Homefront research organizers, and they're going to be due on Friday the 14th. We purposely made this unit a little bit tighter to give us some more space for military research and veteran research. So we're going to get through this one in about 3 weeks, and then we will launch Module 4 on the 14th. One other piece that's coming up. We have been promising this, and we kind of held off the press release about this program intentionally because November 10th, 2025 is the 250th anniversary of the Marine Corps. And the next day, obviously, is Veterans Day. So here's what's happening. Starting tomorrow, our press firm is going to be pitching to people and reporters in your communities. They're pitching what's called an embargoed release, which says, hey, we have this teacher doing this really cool thing in your community. Would you like to talk to them? But you can't publish until at least the 10th. So it's very possible that starting tomorrow and over the next week and a half, I may reach out to you with a reporter who's interested in talking to you. Now, we pitch to reporters for everybody. Not everybody picks up on it. It's kind of a hit or miss luck of the draw. But on November 10th, you, your principal, your superintendent, your communications director in your school will all get a copy of the press release that not only includes your names, but also the silent hero veterans that you are studying. And our hope is that that can not only lead to some recognition for all of the work that you and your students are doing, but also maybe can help make connections, possibly with family, possibly with organizations or archives, or people who might know these people or might be able to make some interesting connections happen. So know that that's in process, and know that if a reporter reaches out to you, or Kate or I connect you with a reporter, it's 100% okay to talk with them. And if you have questions at any time, please reach out to us. All right, that's enough housekeeping. We got a lot of cool stuff coming tonight. So I'm going to turn things over to Christopher Hamner to start talking about the home front and maybe look at World War II in a little bit of a different way.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the NCA for sponsoring the program, and I want to thank all of you guys for taking time out of your busy week to sit and talk with us a little bit more about thinking about World War II as a national event. So in our first webinar, we talked a little bit about the history of the Marine Corps and Marine Corps culture. Tonight, I want to shift the focus a little bit in my part to thinking about the home fronts and what civilians who are not actively out at war are learning about and thinking about the war, what they're being told, and how the war is affecting their lives, even if they are not personally engaged in the fighting. And so I'm going to give a very kind of top-down look at what people are being told. And then in the second half of the webinar, Lynn is going to talk a little bit about bottom-up communities. And I think that gives kind of two halves of what's going on. America is an enormous country in 1941, and so there's a bunch of different ways to look and think about what people are being told about the war. And as I go back in my own teaching, I'm always struck by the way in which this is a mass media event. The government, the Roosevelt administration, takes great pains to manage what people are being told about the war, encouraging them to think about particular parts of it in very specific ways. There are agencies and offices that are part of the federal government that are created to manage this messaging. FDR himself is, I think, famously a master of the still fairly new technology of radio to address people in their homes, to talk to them on a weekly basis about what's happening. And so I want to use my time to talk about the kind of top-down messages that are being presented to the American people and what we can learn from them. World War II is not the first time that the government has actively tried to manage messaging during a conflict. These are a couple of posters that came out during the Great War. But as you can see, they're kind of crudely done. These feel like government bureaucrats taking their best shot at a kind of clumsy effort to get people to, in one case, eat more cottage cheese, in another case, join the Navy. By the time we get to World War II, the messaging is much, much, much more sophisticated. And in part, that's because the government, rather than assigning bureaucrats to do this work, goes to Madison Avenue and to Hollywood and recruits people who are already experts at sending out messages. And so a lot of what I'm going to use tonight is the famous propaganda posters from World War II. Most of them are generated by the Office of War Information. I think they're an incredibly rich set of primary sources. I love using them with my students. And I'm going to walk you through about three things that you might consider experimenting with in your own classes. The, the messages that the government sends out about why America has to fight, what's at stake, they're subtle, they're in many cases kind of beautiful and eloquent. This is Norman Rockwell's series of four posters that are about the four freedoms, what America is fighting for. And remember, unlike every other country in World War II, the war never comes directly home to the 48 states in the lower in the homeland. And so for a lot of Americans, the case has to be a kind of ideological one or aspirational one. What is it that Americans fight for? And in fact, the government puts out a 7 episode series of films called Why We Fight. These are directed by famous Hollywood directors. The first one is done by Frank Capra. They're all available online and they're between like 40 minutes and an hour. If you want a great watch while you're folding laundry or, while your dinner is simmering, they're fascinating because they let you get right in the eyes of people in 1942, 1943 who are trying to understand this massive global event that is unfolding in front of them, and you can see exactly what they're being told. It's also fascinating to me that the government recruits uh, movie studios, cartoon studios, private business to keep hammering home the messages that they're putting out. So there's some great Walt Disney shorts and some other cartoon shorts. Comic book heroes start, running storylines that involve, Superman punching Nazis. Like there is a kind of cohesive national message that's being pushed out primarily through the government, but also through a lot of fascinating sources. And these are really accessible, which is why I love using them in class. So let me walk you through one quick example and kind of how I use it with students. One of the critical messages that I think civilians are getting constantly is that they are expected to make some sacrifices. They're going to have to do without because the war effort and the mobilization that goes with it just demands something from everyone. So when I use these sources with my students, I first ask them to look for some details. Like, what do we know about the central character here? And if you do this a few times with students, they'll get pretty good at either picking out things they can identify or at least asking about things that they can't. So my students want to know what this thing is under her her arm, and I tell them that's a kind of accordion file that people would put coupons and notes and lists and perhaps their money in when they went and did shopping, and they can see, oh, she's got some packages under her arm, she's got a bag of groceries under her left arm. We know a couple of things about her status. She seems to be upper middle class. She's wearing some jewelry. She's married. You can see the wedding ring. It seems to be like a woman who is out doing her grocery shopping. And then we've got this interesting thing going on in the background. So she's out in front with her groceries. In the back, harder to see, but still prominent, is this kind of grayish line of marching soldiers. They've got packs, they've got their rifles. And then we've got this interesting text. There's only, 10, 11 words on this whole poster, but they all hit really specifically. I'll carry mine too. And to me, I think this is drawing a connection. You know, soldiers are marching with their heavy burden. The people at home, the average housewife on the home front in Schenectady or San Diego or Houston is going to carry hers because everyone is part of the same effort. Soldiers are carrying their gear. She has to carry hers too. Why? Because vehicles, tires, all of that stuff has to be focused on the war effort. And uh, there is not sufficient slack in the industrial economy for everybody to keep taking pleasure trips, pleasure drives on the weekends the way they would have in peacetime. This is part of this message. You are expected to do without some things. You are going to have to inconvenience yourself. The total domestic auto production between 1942 and 1945 is like 38 vehicles. It's almost nothing. If you had a car before the war broke out, that is the car you're going to be driving for the duration. And posters like this one tell you, make it count. You're going to have to do your shopping on foot. We see more kind of images of women who are taking a pledge to be part of the war effort. I won't pay more than top legal prices. I'll accept no rationed goods without giving up ration stamps. These posters are all, I think, in this conversation that many of you are familiar with, that the United States government rations a lot of goods, gasoline, sugar, meats, all sorts of things that are more scarce during the war effort. You have to present not just cash, but also a ration coupon. And so, depending on how big your household is, you get more or less of these things. And here they're making it a kind of point of honor. The government can't enforce every consumer transaction. It's a point of honor, and they're using a lot of, I think, kind of emotional plays in these kinds of posters to encourage people to play by the rules. This is a really interesting two-panel cartoon. On the top, it shows Miss Moneybags on the left, who's just bought out the entire butcher shop. On the bottom, ration coupons have made sure that everybody gets a fair share. It's a kind of interesting poster too, because the bottom shows everyone is happier, even though Miss Moneybags has less stuff. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is part of an advertising campaign. This is trying to change how people think. I think it's very easy to look at some of these posters and say, oh, everyone sacrificed so willingly. There was such incredible unity of effort and purpose, and the greatest generation. Everyone understood what they had to do, and nobody questioned it. And I think posters like this, kind of remind me back to like the summer of 2020 when we would see posters like this outside Costco. And if a historian in 75 years says, look at these great signs, everybody understood what they had to do. I think one of the reasons that there are posters like this is they are worried that people are not going to participate. They're trying to use emotional pressure to get people to, out of pride or shame or guilt, to participate in the war effort. And often, particularly for these women, it means giving up some things, canning your own stuff. There are other ways that civilians are being asked to participate in the war effort. This is a poster that is connected back to a conversation we had just before the webinar started about um, women at home being in touch with their boyfriends or their husbands. And here is the United States government telling women, like, part of your job is to make sure that your sweetheart or your partner gets a letter at every underlined mail call. And one of the reasons the government has messages like this is because they understand that a Marine out in the field, if he hasn't heard from his wife or his girlfriend for, a week or two, might start to wonder whether she is remaining faithful or whether he is going to get one of the dreaded letters that starts, Dear John, and ends with the woman leaving him. And so here's the government inserting itself into people's romantic relationships. There's a lot of these posters that I'm going to look at tonight that are talking about what women should do. And here's another one that is kind of connecting this idea of writing letters as an important thing that women do. This woman's married too. We can see her wedding ring. The things that she's clutching to her chest are letters that she's presumably received from her husband. But at the bottom, it instructs her to get a war job, that just missing your husband is not going to bring him back sooner. And so, a second thing that civilians are being encouraged, uh, you know, pushed to do is to go to work in a war industry. And one of the things that I imagine all of you will turn up in your research is how dramatic the shift is from the Great Depression that is still very much visible in the 1930s to a wartime economy. So we've got unemployment over 35% in the middle of the 1930s. By 1942, it's just over 5%. By 1943-44, it's down at 2%. 70% of Americans who are working between 1942 and 1945 are working directly in a war industry. And something like two-thirds of the remainder are working for a business that is supplying the war industry in some other way. So we've got a massive economic evolution, and that has to put a lot of people who were not working 2 or 3 years previous to work. Then think about the fact that 14 million men in their 20s who would otherwise be working these kind of heavy industrial factory jobs are off in uniform serving in the various combat theaters. And so a second set of posters is pushing women to go into the workforce. Uh, in this case, it's in sort of traditional stuff. Uncle Sam needs stenographers, typists, people to work in administrative support. And you can see, the woman is being presented as patriotic, red, white, and blue background, kind of conventionally attractive and conventionally made up. But there's also going to be a push to get women to go into jobs that are more traditionally seen as male coded or masculine jobs, jobs on factory floors, working with heavier tools, jobs on assembly lines. The famous Rosie the Riveter poster on the right is actually a private poster made by the Westinghouse company, but you can see so many posters like the one on the left that are made by the government that are encouraging women to not just go into, say, nursing or secretarial work, but to consider doing this kind of heavier work. Women are needed in the workforce. And one of the things that I see a lot here is the government kind of giving women permission to do this heavier, what would have been considered before the war to be kind of masculine work, and to do that without sacrificing their femininity. There's some interesting things going on. Rosie's made up. A lot of the women that are depicted in these posters are conventionally attractive, doing heavy male work. And I think there's a kind of implicit message here. This is okay. The government puts out public-facing posters. It publishes hundreds of pamphlets. This is a really interesting one that I love to use in my class that goes out to the owners of factories and businesses. And it's brief. I think it's about a dozen pages, but the title is just, very direct. You are going to employ women. And then inside it talks about what that is going to mean and what that's going to entail. And if you flip through a couple of pages, you get some kind of interesting things. So the government is saying, you're going to use women. Women can do all these jobs. Women are, nearly the equivalent of men in a lot of different roles. But if you dig towards the end, you start to see some things in which um, there seems to be a kind of, I don't know, patronizing view of the women who are going to be working. Women are pliant, they're adaptable, they have dexterous, nimble fingers, they're good at repetitive tasks. So there's a on one hand a kind of change and growing sense of what women can do, but on the other hand, there are some real limits, I think, being put into place about uh, many of these jobs women are going to be invited to do and encouraged to do, but not every job. And I love this poster. Like, do you have questions about your work? Ask the nice man who will help you answer these questions. Like, obviously, we won't have women in supervisory positions because that would be crazy. And if you look at some of these posters, I think there's a little bit of misogyny running through them in the way that they portray women as easily distracted or unfocused or not knowing basic things about what you can and cannot do on a factory floor. I mean, ladies, don't wear your hair long around the drill press. That might be bad. Like, who needs to be told this? Um, and some of these posters are, all done by men and all I think kind of playing on these male accepted ideas of what women are like. Of course, women are going to be gossiping in the bathroom. Like, we need to make posters to warn them against that. There are no posters in the men's room discouraging men from talking in the bathroom. And so, one of the other things that I see in these posters, and I try to get my students to look for, is the really complicated ways that femininity is being depicted, right? What is a woman like? What do women do during World War II? Because a lot of this is changing. So we've got, here a delicate, vulnerable mother with her baby, and the kind of horrible claws of the Axis. And then on the other hand, we've got, women talking carelessly, costing sailors their lives. And this is patterned on the wanted poster that you might see for, gangsters in the 30s at the post office. So I think the government messages about what is acceptable for women are kind of all over the place during this period. There's no question that they're effective in moving a lot of women into jobs that even 3 or 4 years earlier would have been seen as just completely out of bounds. And a fascinating thing is the way in which the need to mobilize the entire industrial base provides opportunities for groups that had not been getting any kind of opportunity before the war. And so the Black community, plenty of women will find themselves going into these are hard jobs, but they are high paying. You can make a serious amount of money on these assembly lines. And the demands of this war are beginning to break down some of the norms and the sort of ways things have been done in the 20s and 30s about barring particular kinds of opportunities to specific groups. Here we've got a Dr. Seuss cartoon in which Uncle Sam is kind of gently suggesting that the capitalists and industrialists who are managing the war effort are going to have to start considering, maybe for the first time, to use Black labor. And here is a spot where we see Uncle Sam, I think, showing particular empathy with Black workers who have not been getting a fair shake in the years before the war, and suggesting that this is sort of a maze that they're pushed into to access these great jobs. One of the things that the war is going to do is to bring a lot of the hypocrisy of white America front and center. Black community is going to be asked to work and especially to serve in uniform and to work and to serve on behalf of a country that has treated them as second-class citizens. Within those communities, their newspapers, there is a push for what becomes known as the Double V campaign. Victory abroad over fascism, victory at home over Jim Crow. I always tell my students history is the study of change over time. And one of the fascinating things to me about World War II as a national event is the way it accelerates some of these changes that might not have happened outside of the urgent demand to raise armies, to send them abroad, and to equip them with all of the things they need to fight. One other thing that stands out is the way that these posters use emotion, like really powerful to try to get people to think about how their everyday lives are impacting the war effort. Here we've got the poor little Cocker Spaniel, a Gold Star family. Someone was careless about talking. I mean, some of these posters just try to hit you right between the eyes, right? If you talk too much, this man may die. Won't you give my boy a chance to come home, right? The emotion just kind of, you know, leaps off the page. You are supposed to look into her eyes and feel, her own uh, how the depth of her missing her son and her desperation to have him come home safe. Your part is not to travel. Since we're focusing on the Marines, I think it's really useful to stop and look at the messages that women at home are being given. We talked a little bit about this in Marine culture in the first webinar. Some of these posters are talking about women in service and women in uniform in the Marines. And that's, I think, an interesting kind of juxtaposition to the sort of manly images we get. What does it mean to be a man in a Marines uniform versus a woman in a Marines uniform? And so much of this is of the soldiering part of the war is coded as man's work, a man's job, a man's duty. I'll wrap up with this set of images, which I find to be really fascinating because one of the things that the government discovers 2 years into the war is that these posters have been so successful in getting men to associate uh, military service at the front with being masculine and being manly and being, desirable as a romantic partner, that they are not having enough men who are staying at home and working on the farms. And so there's a parallel set of posters that are trying to encourage young men in Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska to stay on the farm, that this is another way to serve. And some of these posters, I think, are sort of stretched to the point of absurdity, right? Like it's just as manly to be growing sugar beets as it is to be storming the beaches at Iwo Jima. But the evidence the government has is that American men don't buy this. They're not persuaded by the idea that farm work is the same as combat service. And so we're seeing all of these ways in which these poster campaigns are pulling Americans, giving them different messages, different ways to think about what's happening to them, and different ways to think about how they ought to respond. One of the things that comes through incredibly clearly, if you spend any time in the primary sources on the home front, is how Americans are thinking about this conflict in some way almost all the time. Front page newspapers, what they hear on the radio, posters they see at bus stops, posters they see in the break rooms at work, advertisements in popular magazines. Everything is talking about the war effort. There's a war on. Don't forget there's a war happening. Think about what your role in the war is. This is a synagogue in Manhattan and had this banner hanging out in May of 1944, alerting people. Everyone knows there's going to be a cross-channel invasion. Nobody knows what day D-Day is going to be, but in anticipation, the synagogue announces like when it happens, we will be open 24 hours for anyone in the community to come in and engage in, prayerful contemplation. And I love images like this, which just remind us that even for people who are not off in the combat theaters, the war is everywhere and is on everyone's mind almost all the time. I'm going to wrap up the top down part and hand things over to my colleague and friend Lynn, who's going to talk a little bit about bottom up communities. So, Lynn, take it away. You are still muted.
Seriously, y'all, I should be better at this by now. All right. I really like this because we're looking at the same thing from different ways. And like we did before, I want to start each of these with the story of one of our veterans. And tonight we're going to start down in Puerto Rico and talk a little bit about Calixto Lopez Pinheiro from Isabela, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is an absolutely beautiful place. And Lopez Pinheiro served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam with the famed 65th Infantry Division, the Buccaneers. They have amazing stories. If you're into military history, definitely pick that up. But when we start to tell the stories of these veterans, I think sometimes we get into the idea that they're influenced by the national and the international events. They're thinking about the rise of fascism in Europe and Imperial Japan, and they're caught up in the Great Depression. And I think that absolutely had an influence. But just like young people today, I think they're just as, if not more, influenced by the communities in which they grow up, by the families in which they live, by the schools they attend, or the organizations that they're involved with. Because I think we are all a product of the place that we come from. And I'd encourage you to think about this and help your students to stop and think about this. I'll also mention this is a fun profile to check out because the students there did their eulogies in both English and in Spanish. And we have videos of both posted. So I'd encourage you to check that out. It's a good story. I also think it's important that we acknowledge that while the posters after a while sort of start to look the same, I actually think it's important to remember that the 1940s looked different in different parts of America. There is no single story. And I think this just gives three snapshot images of some young African American men and teenagers in zoot suits, those long, oversized jackets. You also have a shepherd out in Montana and a woman putting on lipstick in front of Union Station in Washington, D.C. All of these pictures are taken within a year of each other while the war's going on. And I think they give us hints about three very different stories. And I think it's important that we kind of go past the initial thoughts to think a little deeper about what the home front and community actually look like. Okay, so let's start by why are we doing this? Because I've gotten that question before. Like, we're here to study our silent heroes. Why are we stopping for several weeks and focusing on community instead? And I think it's really important that we step back and say, okay, where did this person come from? Because the story is not just about their sacrifice, but it's also about the sacrifice of their friends, of their family, and of their community. And what we're working towards in your profile is to have somewhere between 2 to 3 paragraphs about this community in the 1940s. Now, that's 2 to 3 paragraphs. That's not a 16-page paper. It's also not one thing. So, in order to do that, we need to kind of come up with some subtopics that you can kind of send your students researching that'll come up with a paragraph to tell us something about the community. And I think sometimes there's some obvious answers. For those of you who live in and around military bases or installations, many of them are created, grow, or explode in size during this time period. And that's a great research topic. I live right next to Fort Meade, Maryland. I hear the bugle calls. There are stories to be told there. Depending on where you live, industry. So we think about the plants that built the bombers or the jeeps and all of the material that was needed for war, like this picture from Long Beach, California, of the women building a B-17 bomber. For those of you who live near the coast, you might take a look at those who are building ships. So, working in the great shipyards. This is Ingalls down in Pascagoula, Mississippi. But there are also shipyards at Charleston, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, outside of Pensacola, Florida. There's so many great examples. And these are kind of the obvious things that our heads go to first. They're not wrong, they're just obvious. So I'm going to actually turn things over to you. I'm going to ask you to go into that Q&A box and say, okay, what are some other topics that your students might be able to research to learn a little bit more about whether it's your community or another community, to learn more about where your silent hero lived, where their family lived during the late 1930s and early 1940s. So pop on into Q&A. What might be some topics? And Kate's going to share some of them because we know if you have an idea, that might give somebody else an idea.
Okay. I've got Gwen saying labor history in the 30s and
Mhm.
40s. That's a good one.
Because when we talk about factories, we have to talk about workers. They go together, right? Was everybody working? Was there a good relationship between labor and management, or wasn't there?
Terry, what did the youth contribute to the war effort? How did the
Mhm.
veteran siblings support the war effort?
Absolutely. And you can find lots of things in communities that young children and teenagers were doing. My grandfather was a child during World War II, and he talked about scrap metal drives. And if you brought a certain amount of scrap metal, you could get candy and a quarter, and you could take it, and they would buy candy with it. But again, that's part of the war effort. And he was a young, he was probably he was about 8, 9 years old at the time when he was doing this. Great. What other things might we research, even if it's specific just to one community?
Patricia's talking about segregation. That could
Hmm.
be an interesting one. Chuck says if they were married, what was the silent hero's wife doing during the war?
Hmm. Because spouses are part of the war too, just like siblings are and just like parents are. And I think sometimes we forget about them, but what were they up to? Were they working? Where were they working? What were they doing? We see a lot of cases where families are moving, right? You move where there are jobs. So certain areas are decreasing in population. Other areas like Seattle are booming in population because there's available war industry jobs. A couple more ideas.
Kind of tied to that, Karen was talking about the impact of immigration from countries that were involved in the
Mhm.
war.
Absolutely.
How did schools address the war? That could
Hmm.
be an interesting one. Is there a strong history of serving in that particular community?
Hmm. Particularly
Um,
Native American communities have very disproportionately high rates of service compared to the nation, even in World War II, where the rate of service was very high.
well, this is an interesting one. Chuck was saying their two heroes lived a few hundred miles away from each other, but one was from a rural area and one was more urban. So, kind of looking at what the differences were in just
Hmm.
one little part of one state could be interesting. Oh, and
Absolutely.
last one, this is a good one.
Hmm.
How did local communities find entertainment for the soldiers in the areas like ours in Southern Maryland so they stayed out of trouble?
Hmm. Particularly places where soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marine tended to embark or disembark. Man, there had to be some activities there, or I don't know what might have happened. And I think those are all good ideas. But I'm also going to encourage you to think of things that maybe you wouldn't think about, like food. I don't think we can talk about World War II without talking about the importance of growing, canning, and preserving food. And there's lots of stories that connect to communities. So you might be looking at stories about growing sugar in Hawaii or in Puerto Rico. The Hershey's Chocolate Company in Pennsylvania makes tropical chocolate, which, from what I hear, was pretty foul, but packed a lot of calories and was sort of kind of like chocolate, but it wouldn't melt. So see if maybe any of your Marines reference that. Um, think about things like canning grapefruit juice or concentrating orange juice in Florida. That's something that comes out of World War II. Growing potatoes in Idaho, or wheat, or corn, or hops. There's so many different things. And this is part of the war effort too. So don't overlook something like this because that's part of the story as well. I also would mention, make sure you understand that uh, World War II transformed how we eat. Everything from one of my favorite M&Ms, because it melts in your mouth, not in your hand, but also things like Spam or dehydrated cheese, leading to Kraft mac and cheese. Started in the late 1930s, but became popular and grew in popularity after World War II. Also, things like box cake mix. Many of these things connect to many communities, and that's something that all our students can relate to. I would also encourage when you think about these communities, think about people and organizations within these communities. I think the one that comes to a lot of our heads first is the American Red Cross, right? They do a lot during World War II, whether it's training nurses to go overseas or volunteers to go overseas, but they also have programs where they train people to help in hospitals because so many medical staff are serving overseas to assist the doctors and nurses who are there. A lot of communities are doing a lot to support the Red Cross in their area and raise money to buy things to help them along the way. So I mentioned entertainment. The United Service Organization, the USO, took performers all over the world. And I had to throw in a profile of one of our silent heroes who lost her life during World War II and is buried in Manila American Cemetery. But also think about other local organizations, whether they be the Gold Star Mother organization, veterans organizations. There are some groups at churches or synagogues that are very active, and they do everything from publishing letters to talk about where the boys are at any given point in time and kind of keep the community informed. But they also do things like raise money and make sure that there are care packages going over and taking care of their kids in the military who are so far away. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is narrow it down, pick 2 or 3 things, and think broadly about community, not just as a physical place. Okay, so how does this work? Where are we going in this module? Our goal, obviously, is to learn as much as we can about these communities and these families because the families are part of the sacrifice. So we can think of that in terms of place. We can think of that in terms of what's going on economically, socially, politically, education, work, religious affiliation, sports, entertainment, fun. There's so many different ways to take this. And so, a couple tips of how do we do this? Sometimes it's starting with the census, right? Here's a census from Fayette County, Alabama in 1940. And if we zoom in on a Silent Hero's family and those around him, where is everybody working? A real quick look says that just about everybody's working either for the lumber company or the sawmill. So what are they doing? They're working as truckers, a fireman, a lumber stacker. There's a lot of work there. And I have to be honest, this one kind of surprised me. So we did some digging in some local newspapers, and I learned quite a lot about Alabama's timber industry. And I think that's something we don't necessarily automatically associate with Alabama. So one thing we're going to do this module, everybody is going to be required to do some searching for newspaper articles. Newspaper articles are the best way to get an idea about what's being talked about around the dinner table and in the communities, and as people are waiting in line at the butcher shop or the grocery store. Now, there's lots of different ways to do that. Some of the best databases to work with, I think the 2 best are either Chronicling America through the Library of Congress or newspapers.com, which you can get to with your Ancestry or Ancestry Classroom subscription. These do a good job of searching. There's also other databases. Check with your local or public librarians about what really digitizes the newspapers in your community, in your area. And I'm also going to encourage you to check out what access you have through your college and university alumni databases. We had an interesting question last year, and I was trying to look up something in Los Angeles, California. Now, I don't have access to the LA Times, but I went into the Penn State Library because I'm an alum and put in my alumni number, and I was able to get access that way and search for something to help a teacher. So never doubt, it's worth checking it out. You never know what you might find. Now, here's my question though. If you just tell your students, okay, here's the database we're going to search, they're going to search the name of the person. And they might find stuff, but they're going to start to get frustrated. Go into that Q&A box. What are some tips or structures or ideas we have to give to our students to help them search a newspaper database effectively and efficiently? Because while research rabbit holes are fun, they can get very frustrating if we're not finding what we're looking for. So what are some strategies we need to think about with newspaper searching?
Keywords or phrases.
Mm-hmm.
Using filters for location,
Mm-hmm.
limiting to your state and local areas. Use terms such as war effort or war industries.
Mm-hmm.
Specific dates, place. Filters are your friends.
Absolutely. And I would say also, don't limit yourself just to 1941 to 45. This newspaper article is 1951. It's a little afterwards, but it still gives us a sense of what's going on in the early 1940s in this industry.
Looking at advertisements.
Absolutely. Those advertisements and those political cartoons might send you down a really interesting rabbit hole and might provide a really interesting illustration for something you're talking about.
Looking in the socials part
Mm-hmm.
of the newspaper, organizations that are supporting or giving updates on what's
Mm-hmm.
going on.
If people are having a fundraiser, where's the money going to? Lots of different things, but make sure to help your students know how to approach this and model it. We've got a good lesson plan that are part of the instructions. Obviously, it's up to you how and if you use it, but it'll give you specific strategies you can share with your students, even if you don't have time to do the full-blown lesson plan. All right. In the interest of time, couple other tips. If you can, try to identify family members and family records. If a family member knows stuff, oh my goodness, they can open doors that we can never imagine. And it gets us beyond the military stories to get the stories of those other family members who survived. Now this is not an NCA burial. These two brothers, Victor and John Akimoto, are buried in Lorraine American Cemetery in France. But when our teacher was researching them, he actually stumbled upon a family who had a trunk full of artifacts and was able to share all kinds of family artifacts and photographs and medals, and lots of different family stories and bits and pieces from his sister. And it was really her children at that point, but also from the fact these are two brothers who lost their lives serving with the 442nd, but also from the third brother who survived, who ended up as a teacher. He was an art teacher in Dodea schools in Europe for his career. The third brother is actually standing with their mother when the cemetery was opened in 1960 with his brother's grave. So, amazing story. I can go down that rabbit hole, but I'm going to leave the link so you can do that. The other thing is think about what might be in your community. If we know the person had a religious affiliation, are there records at the church, at a school, at a university? Were they involved in athletics in some kind of way? What did they participate in? And what clues might that give us about the community? One thing you'll find if they were involved, especially in boys' athletics, oh my goodness, there's a lot of local newspaper coverage you might be able to stumble upon and find. Our research process is exactly the same, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but we've got some prompt questions to get you started. We've got a column where you respond. Remember, use your own words there. How do you know it? What's the source it links to? And link the materials for your research mentor to check. If it's live online, give them the link to that. If it's something you've uploaded, let them know what that file name is so that they can get in and see it. We also have space for additional information and questions. But also, the bibliography chart changes a little bit because the sources that you're likely to encounter change. Pay attention when you cite your first newspaper article. If you get the citation right the first time, it's so much easier as you go through. And again, follow the model. If you're not sure or have questions, ask. We're happy to help you. All right. Last set, pro tips for the night. Number one, learn from Module 1 and build. Your research mentors are hard at work. They're getting you your feedback. You'll have that in the next few days. If you didn't do something perfectly, don't stress about it. fix it for the next time. There's a reason we don't wait till the end to get this material in. If they send you a question with a research strategy, know that they're not attacking you. They're actually throwing out an idea, asking a question. I think sometimes online we get a little scared that like everybody's out to get us. And with an online class, that can happen. It's not the case. This is a tight module, so pace yourself. If you break it into 2 or 3 smaller sections, maybe work on one of it the first week, one the second week, one the third week, so you're not trying to throw it all in at the end. Stay focused on the home front. Use your newspapers. As always, don't get frustrated. Please ask us for help. I know several of you have met with your research mentors, have met with me, have met with Kate, depending on availability. Know that that is our job and we're happy to do it. And quite frankly, it's way more fun than most of the things that I have on my to do list on any given day. And I'm thrilled to do it. We enjoy this. Um, 2 quick notes for the next 2 modules. I don't know if you've heard, but the government's not open right now, so we might need to make a couple of adjustments. 2 things. First is at the end of the Homefront module, teachers, you are eligible for the first half of your stipend. So what does that mean? That means your life before the war is complete. All the pieces are there, all the files are uploaded, all the sources are cited, and any corrections to those citations have been made. Same thing with module 2. You've turned it in, you've gotten the feedback from the mentor, you've made any and all corrections, and all the files are uploaded or linked. What'll happen at the end of this module is I'll work with your research mentors. They certify, like, yep, this person's good to go. Take a look at it. First check goes in the mail. I will let you know when your check goes in the mail. Please track that and pay attention to that. We had some checks go into USPS La La Land last year where they were mailed and either came 2 months late or not at all. And if that happens, please reach out to me. Our goal was to keep this module kind of tight to give us more time to focus on veteran experience and military experience. Now, a key that makes those 2 modules a lot easier is the military files from St. Louis. And I can guarantee you that your military files have been requested and are sitting in the queue. And I have, by this point, I should have about 50% of the files, and I have 2 of them. And they were postmarked on September 30th. So we may need to make some adjustments in our schedule and our plan. What those adjustments will be, I don't know, but we're not going to move anything up. So what we're going to say to you tonight is hang with us. On November 14th, we'll give you an update. So the goal is get this module done. And then based on what is happening and if files are starting to come, we'll make a decision and decide what, if anything, we need to do from there. So hang with us on that one. We'll work with you. We know there's going to be some challenges, but heck, I don't know. Hopefully this will get settled because we really want to get these files. I can tell you the 2 that I have are like 250 pages long each. They're amazing and there's great stuff in them. So I'm hoping to get inundated hopefully sooner rather than later with materials we can get you to help. All right, that's our endpoint for tonight. So we're going to stay here and answer any and all questions you have. Big thank you to our friends at the National Cemetery Administration. Even though they can't join us tonight, they made sure that we knew that we could keep going and support you all and continue this program without interruption. So we appreciate that. Please take a moment to do your survey tonight. So either use your phone in the QR code or tinyurl.com/nhd-nca-live. Like I said, we got to keep it simple because I've got to remember what it is. This will give us the feedback we need, but also make sure we can go in and give you attendance credit tomorrow. All right.
Hey, Lynn, can I throw in a tip and a fun fact?
Please, go for it.
So I loved hearing the brainstorming ideas about places to look for more details about life on the home front. And I love the person who suggested looking at magazine ads. A source that one of my students brought me like 5 or 6 years ago that I would really recommend you check out is Boys Life magazine, which is all scanned online. This is the magazine published by the Boy Scouts of America, and it continues to publish during the Second World War, and it's targeting, boys age 10 to 15 or 16. But there's some really fascinating stuff in there. It's very easy to access. And some of the ads are really interesting because they are talking about, well, dad isn't here right now. Dad has a very important work to do elsewhere, but he'll be home soon and you'll get to do all of the things that you remember doing before the war happened. And I remember there's one ad by Remington who manufactures ammunition, and there's like a sort of drawing of a father and son shooting deer, and then the copy says something like, right now you can't go deer hunting because dad's using that ammunition to shoot, Japanese people, but the war won't last forever. It's crazy, and like it's not meant to be funny. It's like dad's doing something very serious, but you'll be back, we won't be shooting the Japanese forever. You'll be back hunting, and remember, Remington is the most reliable ammunition. Um, so that's a great source, and you can kind of flip through them really quickly. The Internet Archive has the entire series, 12 a year. Just dip in, and you might find something interesting in there. The fun fact is about that chocolate that you said tasted so bad, and it came up in my class just last week, which is why I know this fun fact. That chocolate tasted bad for a reason. It was the government instructed them to come up with a formulation that tasted bad because they were afraid, and I think reasonably so, that if the chocolate tasted like a Hershey bar, the soldiers would dig into their meal, would eat the chocolate bar, and throw the rest of it away. And the government kind of understands that they are mobilizing an army of children, more or less, and that the C ration or the K ration is meticulously designed to give them all of the calories and all of the macronutrients and things that they need. And so the chocolate, it doesn't just taste bad because it's shelf stable. It tastes bad because they don't want people to just eat the candy, throw away, the tinned turkey, and slowly starve themselves.
Very interesting. All kinds of good stuff here. All right, looks like we've got some questions. Kate, go ahead.
Yeah, before I start with a question, just a comment that came up that I wanted to share that was interesting. Gwen is a former Red Cross volunteer and employee, and she said folks would still talk in the 1990s about how the Red Cross treated them during World War II. So it's very interesting.
A lot of times, and look for this, like they will talk, service members will talk about this in letters. They'll talk about the donut dollies. They'll talk about getting a break or getting hot chocolate or magazines from home or the ability to take an afternoon and play board games. Like there's a lot of that. And these Red Cross volunteers are mobilized across not only Europe, but also across the Pacific.
So the first question I think is for Christopher. So Kristen says some Marines are stationed on ships, some are separate units. Can you explain that breakdown or what the percentage was between the two? Were their missions or experiences then drastically different?
That is a great question, and I cannot, off the top of my head, give you the breakdown of the percentages. But if someone sends me an email, I can find that out for you and write you up something that will be helpful if you are trying to figure out where your particular service member fits in. It's a great question, and it's not something I have committed to memory.
Mhm. But that's something we'll get into more in the next module because or once we
Oh,
get
maybe
into
I'll prepare
military
for that. Yeah,
experience, we'll throw that in because we're going to
perfect.
focus on, you know, the vast majority of the Marines served in the
Yeah.
Pacific Theater, and they served in one of those two capacities and almost always moved by ship. So we'll bring some of that in and talk more about that. And by that point, please, we should have military files, and you should know a little bit more about what the job was and what unit your Marine was stationed with during that time. And that'll help us kind of piece together some of that experience as well.
Heather just said when looking at veteran families, keep an eye out if their spouses are still living because it may be worth trying to get a firsthand account.
Sometimes they are. If you have the ability to speak with a spouse, a child, a niece or nephew, grandchild, please reach out and go for it. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But man, if when families will sit down with students, sometimes you have some of the best conversations, not just for the students, but also for those family members. Because remember, they're talking about their dad or their uncle or their grandma or their best friend. It's more and more rare with World War II, but it still happens. And when it does, it's pretty darn magical.
Not a question, but a comment. Gwen just started listening to our next book and how those who went to war didn't hunt after the war. And she said that was a sentiment that her neighbor, a World War II vet who fought in France, also shared. So,
Absolutely. We're going to get into some of this in the veteran experience, and all veterans are different. But I don't know of any World War II veteran that I had the pleasure to speak with who wasn't changed in some way. Not that they were all changed in the same way, but it absolutely did change people, their perspective on the world and what they wanted to do.
and
All right.
Krista has another question that will tie in better with the military section, but I will copy and paste these in
Mhm.
an email to you, Christopher, so you can be prepared to answer them for next time.
I'm excited.
All right, that's it so far, unless anyone has anything else.
All right. No, we'll definitely, yeah, we've got a good question about where do Marines come from? Where are they, proportionally in the country? And Marines are a little unique and have some special, tend to concentrate in certain areas of the country. We'll talk more about that as we move forward, and some of the traditions of Marines and kind of how that affected their history and the military units that are built and fought and fight in the Pacific Theater. All right. Last chance. Anything else? I'll go ahead and pause here. I'm going to say thank you to the National Cemetery Administration for allowing us to continue this and to make this important program such an important priority. Thank you for your time this evening and this week, and we are very excited to see what you find as you research these silent heroes, home fronts, and communities.